On this episode of Inside the Octagon, we break down the massive UFC 252 main event, Miocic versus Cormier 3. In this, the third bout of their epic trilogy, the most successful UFC heavyweight of all time, Stipe Miocic, takes on his greatest foe, Daniel Cormier.
Oh, he hurt him! Oh, Cormier knocks Miocic down! History! UFC history!
Looking to end his storied career on a high, former champion Daniel Cormier returns to the Octagon for the final time, in an effort to reclaim what was once his and lay to rest any doubt as to who is the baddest man on the planet. But having evened the score in their rematch at UFC 241,
DC in a world of trouble, he is down! Stipe exacts his revenge!
Stipe Miocic will be out to prove once again his standing as history's greatest ever UFC heavyweight champion. Legacy is on the line at UFC 252. Hello and welcome to UFC Inside the Octagon. John Gooden alongside Dan Hardy, and we are back for a big fight. A trilogy. It is Stipe Miocic versus Daniel Cormier 3. Dan Hardy, this is a big one. We've had some big trilogies in UFC history, but I'm not sure they get much bigger than this.
Well, you know, this one's for the heavyweight title, and it's also, it's so competitive. I think there were surprises in both fights. I think DC was a surprise to Miocic in the first fight, and I think Miocic came in well prepared for DC and maybe was a little underestimated by the defending champ in the second fight. It doesn't get more evenly matched than this. I think both of these guys have to bring their best game. They have to be in condition. They have to be ready to go. And I think it's going to be a hard-fought 5 rounds for the belt this time.
So these two apparently have grown apart in terms of how much they like one another. There's a lot of information that they've now got between themselves after having met twice before. So Dan, we're going to unpick all of that. We start off with the facts and the stats as we normally do, and we see the champion versus the challenger. And I think we just have to go straight down to the stats for this one, Dan. We've been here before, so let's have a look at this. And Stipe Miocic is just such a great champion. Most title fight wins in heavyweight history. Of course, there's a lot of accolades we can put on the side of Daniel Cormier as well. But what I also like are the striking stats and the wrestling stats. And if we start with the striking, Dan, Miocic and DC, who people typically think about as a wrestler, both hitting the top of the leaderboards there with the amount of outputs.
Yeah, I think these stats speak to the fact that both of these guys are actually mixed martial artists. You know, you've got DC with a strong wrestling skill set that brings a very high volume of strikes, and then Miocic that's got a great striking game, but is complemented by the fact that he can wrestle with these guys. I think, you know, this is not a fight where you can bring in one skill set and compete. Both of these guys need to bring their A game, they need to bring their MMA game, and they need to compete with each other in every single range. This is going to be far harder fought than the last two battles. And I think, you know, the surprises on each side in the last two fights are gone this time around. This is a realistic fight between two of the best heavyweights on the planet. And they both need to be MMA fighters.
Let's get into the analysis, Dan. Let's get into the meat of this one. And we have to talk about those first two fights. I think chronologically, let's kick off with that first fight. You said at the top of the show, maybe some surprises there for Stipe Miocic, but it was an emphatic performance from DC.
Well, first of all, I think DC looked great. I think there were some surprises in that first fight for Miocic, who was on a great streak as a heavyweight champion. And I think he looked at DC as being the smaller fighter, you know, possibly not being able to be as physically imposing as he was at light heavyweight, and kind of being able to bully him a little bit. You know, the energy from Miocic when he came in there, the first, minute or so, he was pushing DC back. He was using his footwork and his head movement. He was using his straight punches. But he became a bit stationary, and that's where we start to see the low kicks coming from DC. He was chopping in heavy with those low kicks, and that made Miocic more stationary. It also made him more eager to punch DC in the face, but that also allowed DC to work his way into the clinch, which is where he wants. He wants that single necktie, and he wants to do all of his work from there because, he's got an 8-inch reach disadvantage. It's something that he has to negate regardless of what range he's in. I also honestly think that Miocic underestimated the punching power of DC. And I think maybe DC surprised himself as a heavyweight with that kind of power. But that single necktie, keeping his opponent exactly where he was, and then coming over with the right hook, it was just beautiful. It seemed like something that was so comfortable and so rehearsed for DC. He was able to put a lot of power and a lot of leverage into it. And it was an angle that Miocic just wasn't expecting a power punch to come from.
So that left the scoreline at 1-0 for Daniel Cormier, who then got the heavyweight title. He went away, defended it. Stipe Miocic, meanwhile, we didn't see him until he fought Daniel Cormier for a second time, Dan. So kick off with how that one played out.
Well, DC, again, 2 good rounds to start the fight off. I think Miocic did good things in each round. I think, his footwork was good at times. I think his long-range striking was good at times. But ultimately, he ended up standing still. DC ended up chopping into his legs. And in the first round, he scored a big takedown, which allowed him to control Miocic for over 3 minutes of the round. And he landed a lot of strikes, and he took very few in return. And then the second round, I was expecting him to do much the same thing. I thought he was going to wrestle again, but he didn't. It was much more of a clinch onslaught. He was pushing Miocic back, slipping his head off the center line and getting that single necktie and really punishing him with it. I felt, although he took more shots in that second round, I felt like it was a better round for DC, a more impactful round for him at least. I think he did more damage to Miocic in that second. So it set him up for a great third round.
So the end of the second round, Dan. A lot of pundits will be looking at this fight and say the turning point was at the end of the third. But what was interesting was DC on the stool at the end of the second, where his corner were going crazy, and he sort of responded with a, am I winning the fight or am I losing the fight? You had an interesting take on this. Why do you think it was so significant at the end of round 2 rather than at the end of round 3 when clearly his energy levels were dropping off?
Well, I think DC feels like he's cruising in this fight. When he came back to the stall in the second round and he sat down, there was a real confidence to him to how the fight was going. But that, for me, wasn't replicated in his corner team. They seemed to be far more realistic of the dangers of Stipe Miocic and his ability to kind of turn a fight round and to come back from the brink, if you like. And there was an exchange that it was talked about by the commentary team as well, because DC said, am I losing? But I don't think he was asking that question as in he might thought one of those rounds had slipped away from him. I thought he asked the question like, well, why are you worried so much? Because Bob Cook was saying, you've got to keep your hands up, you've got to move your head, etc., etc. And I thought that was almost a reflection of where DC's confidence was. I think he felt like the fight was completely under his control. So then going out into the third round, I think he felt like he was going to replicate the same things and there wasn't going to be an adjustment from Miocic. There was a key point in the third round where Miocic was able to take DC down. I mean, the takedown wasn't really worth a great deal for Miocic, but it did prove to me that DC was starting to fade. And I think he expected to get Miocic out of there quicker than that. I think that's the truth of it. I think that he expected Miocic to not quite be as adaptable and as tenacious in that second fight as he was in previous matches that we've seen.
So on to the final round then, Dan, where, it brings us around to this trilogy fight then.
Yeah, again, Miocic now starts off, he's light pressuring again. I think he can start to sense that DC's fading a little bit here, but he also doesn't want to put his foot on the gas too much and put himself in reach of that single necktie or those big swiping punches. I mean, there's actually a really nice point here where you see Miocic back him up. And he's pressuring, he's baiting with high hands. He's trying to get DC to reach out and meet his hands here, or at least try and be reactive to the straight punches that are coming towards DC's head from Miocic. And that is what then opens up that beautiful opportunity for the left hook to the body. And the reason that this worked so well, and the reason that Miocic stuck to it, for 2 reasons. One, because DC is reaching out. This is not a target that had been used in the past against him. Miocic had tried with knees in a couple of the rounds. He also tried knees in the first fight, and he just didn't have the same kind of impact. Whereas this shot, whether it was the angle that he was coming at, whether it was because DC was inhaling or exhaling at the time, his midsection was relaxed, and he took this left hook, and he showed it on his face. And DC's got a great poker face. He's very good at hiding when he's hurt, but he was hurt in that moment. Miocic recognized it immediately and then started, as a boxer would, to build his whole game around that target. Everything then was starting to set everything up for the left hook to the body, because when he was landing, it was visibly hurting DC. And I think that's the difference here with Miocic. I think when he feels like something's successful outside of his regular skill set, that's when he starts to apply it more. And the left hook to the body worked. It worked clearly the first time, which is why he stuck to it and got the finish.
It's wonderful stuff. So that leaves us with a finish for DC, a finish with Miocic. Thank you for taking us through that, Dan. On the other side of the break, Dan is going to look at how these fighters might achieve victory in this rubber match. So stay with us. We'll be back with more after these. Welcome back to UFC Inside the Octagon. John Gooden alongside Dan Hardy for this huge trilogy bout between Stipe Miocic and Daniel Cormier. In part one, we talked through the first two fights. We are now at the rubber match. This is to determine the greatest heavyweight UFC champion of all time. Dan, they've now processed quite a lot of information from their previous two meetings. They've been away with their coaches. You've dived into the footage, starting with the champion Miocic. How do you think he gets this one won?
Okay, well, I think, if you look back at their two previous fights, and if you look at what Miocic has done in his body of work in the UFC, you can kind of piece together the perfect game plan for both of these guys. It's all about them being focused and sticking to that game plan. And for Miocic, he can't get stationary like he has done in the last two fights, because that's where he becomes vulnerable. He's got good footwork, he moves very well for a heavyweight, and he's got good long-range punches, especially with that 8-inch reach advantage. So the basic first thing to do, stick and move. You've heard it in boxing so many times. Stay on your toes, stay mobile, and keep that long-range jab in his face. He's just got to stay moving. If DC's constantly walking after Miocic and walking onto that jab, it's going to get very frustrating. And then we know that Miocic can line him up for the power punch, the right hand that comes behind the jab. The other thing that's been exposed in DC is that the rising attacks are a vulnerability for him. I've been trying to think of a way of explaining DC's guard, and it's almost like an umbrella. It's like he's covered from everything that's coming over the top and straight at him. He's leaning the front of the umbrella towards the force. But things coming up underneath, knees, front kicks to the body, the left hooks to the body, those kind of things, all those rising attacks that Miocic uses are going to get through that guard, because it's not, DC can't cover the whole thing. He can't be bringing the hands down because that makes his head vulnerable. So mixing the targets up is going to be a massive key for Miocic. The one thing he has to couple this with is anti-clinch. DC's constantly going to be trying to get his hands on him to negate that 8-inch reach advantage. But Miocic also has to know when to disengage. In the third round of their second fight, there was a point where Miocic was backed up against the fence and he hit him clean with an uppercut, circled off and hit him one more time with the same uppercut to create space. Like I said, there are pieces in both of those fights that you can take out and make the perfect game plan. They just need to stick to it. And Miocic needs to know when to attack, but also when to disengage. That's been the issue in a lot of the previous exchanges, is he's not known when to disengage. He's missed a punch, he's been tagged a couple of times, maybe a little bit of ego gets the better of him and he wants to stay in the pocket and trade a few more. Understanding that he's the one that's got the reach advantage and forces DC to move on to him is going to be a massive key. But anti-clinch, striking in and out of the clinch and defending takedowns is obviously going to be a part of his game, because that's what DC wants to do. Takedown offense for Miocic is very high as well, and I think that it can make DC work and force him to to feel how big Miocic is as a heavyweight. I know they're around the same weight, but physiologically Miocic is the bigger guy, and I think this will also, in the long run, it will be taxing for DC. I think DC will be carrying a heavyweight around for the whole fight, and that's going to wear on his cardiovascular system. That's where Miocic finds his way into the rest of the MMA fight, because footwork and boxing I think he's got, but it's not until DC gets tired that the wrestling game becomes a part of Miocic's arsenal. And I think what he can expect, what we saw in the second fight, is that once DC's taken down, he's going to turn to his belly to scramble to his feet. And if Miocic can work that, the back of the head pressure, turtle control, attacks from the turtle, possibly even threaten the neck like DC does, I think there might be a vulnerability there. It would be an ace card that Miocic can pull out once DC's tired, though, and that's the big key. He's got to make DC work.
You talk about an ace card, and a lot of people will be thinking back to that second fight where Miocic found that left hook to the body. Do you not immediately think that maybe they should be targeting the midsection of DC quite early on through this fight?
Yeah, I think they should. And I mean, we've seen it in the last two fights. You know, there was a great point in the first fight where Miocic created space up against the fence and landed a knee to the midsection of DC. The last fight as well, the most recent one, there were two times where Miocic landed to the body with knees, and I think it hurt DC, but he hit it very well. It seems to be the hook around the side that did the damage, and I certainly think that there's options for more knees, for body kicks, for all kinds of attacks that Miocic could be using in the early rounds. Of course, DC is going to expect it, but that might also give Miocic a bit of breathing room because DC then can't feel like he can just walk forward and Frankenstein him and just keep grabbing onto his wrists. Because if he's reaching out, he's vulnerable to the body. And if Miocic has got that nice slip off to the side and left hook, as well as all the other weapons that he's got to attack the body, I absolutely think it's going to slow DC down, even if just psychologically the hesitation of moving forward.
Okay, Dan, but what does Daniel Cormier need to do to get back that heavyweight title?
Well, the same thing is again for DC. You know, we've seen what he can do against Miocic. We've seen him have success. We've seen him win rounds clearly. The low kicks is going to be a key because assuming that Miocic does the right thing and gets on his bike and keeps moving, you've got to slow the man down. You've got to take his legs away. So DC chopping into those legs, buckling that knee is going to be a big key to slowing him down, which will then allow him to punch his way into the clinch. It's always that single necktie with the left hand. And with the left hand single necktie, he hits uppercuts and hooks over the top. He's able to manipulate the way his opponent moves and also to weigh on them as well and make them feel like they're working harder than they actually want to be. But they're two big facets in this game. He's got to slow Miocic down and he's got to find his way into the clinch to take away that reach advantage. I also think that we saw in the first round of the second fight, he's got great wrestling, of course, as we know. Like, DC takes you down and he holds you down, he keeps you there. So even if DC gets one takedown a round, it's usually enough to seal him the round as long as, you know, he does it early enough. And I think that's what we saw in the first round of the second fight. And I think that's what we're going to see in this one. A heavier wrestling offensive. DC is the master at controlling the back, at wearing people down, at forcing them to give the rear naked choke because they just don't want any more. And, you know, if he's going to put a clinic on Miocic, same thing again, he's got to use some of that wrestling to keep this an MMA fight. If he just tries to box, I think Miocic can use his footwork. If he implements his wrestling as well, that's going to slow Miocic down. It's going to win him rounds. It's going to take time out of the clock that Miocic has to steal back in the later rounds.
What's been quite interesting is that we've got some quotes actually from both of these fighters. Naturally, we hear more from Daniel Cormier. He is a broadcaster of Stipe Miocic, a very busy man and the champion, of course. But Dan, I've been listening to DC and it's keeping him awake at night, particularly the aspect of lack of conditioning. So he's been working on that. But one addition that he's spoken about is bringing Mark Henry into his camp. Now, I know that you're a big fan of Coach Mark Henry. He has been dissecting Stipe Miocic. Cormier's only watched that last fight once, that second fight. I only watched it one time. What good do you think bringing Mark Henry into this camp will do for Cormier?
Well, I mean, the analytical mind of Mark Henry, being able to watch the way that Stipe moves, how he places his feet, where he places his feet, his tendencies with his hands and all those kind of things they're going to be valuable for DC because that's going to allow him to, you know, read those ranges and close distance quicker and probably get his head in safer places when Miocic is throwing. You know, the trajectory of the punches from Miocic is quite, it's quite systematic because he's got a boxing background. Someone like Mark Henry is going to be able to read those patterns and be able to educate DC as to his safest approach in there.
And Stipe has been pushed on the subject of this being a smaller octagon. Do you feel like it's going to benefit either one of these fighters?
I think in this fight it makes a big difference, especially given the fact that these boys are heavyweights. The thing is, if Miocic needs to be on his bike and moving and trying to create space around him, the bigger the octagon, the better. If he's got a football field, he's going to be far more difficult to catch for DC. Whereas if DC can quickly circle him into a fence post, then it's going to be more claustrophobic in there for him. I think it plays into DC's hands with it being a smaller octagon. But then at the same time, we know that Miocic does great work on the back foot, moving away from his opponents, trying to close him down. So I may be way off, but if I'm Miocic, I would prefer more space, I think.
Now, DC has said, whatever the result, this is his last fight in the UFC and mixed martial arts, I would assume. Now, we were on Fight Island and we saw a trilogy between Shogun and Little Nog. And speaking with Little Nog that week, you could see the emotion in him and just his desire to win, which is obviously always there, but it just set things up a little differently. Do you think that this makes any difference to the way that Cormier approaches this fight, given that it's his last?
I think it makes a difference in training camp. I don't necessarily think it makes a difference in the fight. And I think that's a good example is the Nogueira Shogun fight. Most people would, and I said it on the comms to you, that last round that's not the last round of the fight, that's the last round of Nogueira's career. Like, what do you do with that last 5 minutes? What's your mentality going in? It's most likely not going to be any more reckless than any other round of your career because you don't want to go out on a big knockout. So what we saw was, quite a strategic performance from Nogueira in that fight. And I think that DC will do the same thing in the fight. The difference is in training camp. The difference is every time he's getting on that airdyne and he's doing that, oh, here we go again. You know what I mean? It's not here we go again. It's here we go one last time. There's an extra bit of push that you'll get from that because you know that this is the last opportunity to give a good account of yourself. DC was embarrassed with that last performance because he got tired and his whole thing is about embracing the grind. And unfortunately, it just didn't work out for him in that last fight. He didn't seem as prepared as he normally was, which I thought was interesting because he was actually lighter in weight. The first fight he came in, I think it was 246, and then the second time was 235 and a half. I mean, I don't know exactly where the weight difference was. I don't know whether that was muscle mass that he was lacking. I don't know. There's lots of questions around that difference in weight, but you would expected him to be heavier in the second one than the first, and he wasn't. I think we're going to see DC coming in around 240 and being in great condition, like ready to go. Like, because the thing is as well, if you're a heavyweight, this is the question about the body shots. Like, how much conditioning is he doing? What kind of conditioning is he doing? Like, DC making 205 had to do a lot of supplementary training to get to 205. But the knock-on effect of that supplementary training is a physical hardening of the body. Like, the abdominal wall would be hardened, like the stomach and the body's more toned and tighter, better for taking shots. I don't think necessarily it's a weight thing for DC. I think it's a condition thing. And I think given the fact that this is DC's last fight ever, he's going to want to come in, typical DC, being able to put 5 rounds of hard work on the champion and get that belt back.
Dan, thank you very much for your thoughts. As always, this is a big one for all the marbles, right? For the heavyweight title, baddest man on the planet. It is the rubber match as well. DC has said, bring your wrestling shoes. And Stipe Miocic has said he doesn't really like Cormier as much as he did when they first met. So there's so much at play here. Thank you very much for watching. Keep the conversation going using the hashtag Inside the Octagon. Tweet at UFC Europe. Thank you so much for this one. Enjoy the fights. We'll see you next time.